The air inside Manila's international airport carried the usual chorus of rolling suitcases, airport announcements, and arriving passengers reunited with family. But among the sea of travelers that morning, a very different kind of group stepped through the arrival gates. They moved slowly, with an almost unnatural stiffness, like shadows peeled from a war zone and dropped abruptly into a place too warm, too bright, too alive for the weight they carried. Professor Elena Cruz stood waiting just beyond the barrier, holding a large welcome sign decorated with the symbols of the Ukrainian flag. She had greeted many refugee groups before: Syrian families fleeing civil war, Afghan scholars escaping persecution, Rohingya children saved from camps. She knew trauma. She had learned to recognize the glassy eyes, the tight expressions, the way people clung to each other because they were all they had left. But these students were unlike any group she had ever seen. They did not cling. They barely even walked near each other. They were spaced apart like magnets forced to repel. Their eyes were dull, colorless, unfocused, as if they were still trapped inside the moment they left home, frozen in the fear they carried. One girl near the back walked with her gaze locked on a boy 2 places ahead. The stare was sharp, cold, almost predatory. Not fear, not sorrow, hatred. The sight made Elena's stomach twist. Whatever had happened to these young people, it wasn't ordinary trauma. It was something fractured deep within their group, something personal, something dangerous. Still, she forced a warm smile and lifted the sign higher. "Mabuhay, welcome to the Philippines," she called gently. Only 3 students raised their heads. The rest kept their eyes glued to the floor. So began one of the most difficult refugee interventions of her career. Elena guided them toward the waiting vans. As they walked, she observed carefully the way none of them spoke, the way they flinched at sudden noises, the way they kept distance from one another even when the space around them grew crowded. In the van, the silence was absolute. No whispered side conversations, no shared glances. They sat as though each was trapped inside their own isolated bubble of dread. At the university dormitory, the same unsettling behavior continued. The students lined up in a perfect single-file row, spaced evenly apart. It reminded Elena chillingly of evacuation footage she had seen from Eastern Europe, groups marching away from bombed buildings under military escort. Sister Maria, the dorm manager, approached her as they observed the students settling awkwardly into the common room. "Is this normal?" she whispered. "Are refugees usually like this?" Elena shook her head. "No, usually they stay close, almost unable to separate. But these students, they act like they can't stand to be near one another." That night, after the students retired to their rooms, Elena sat at her desk and reviewed their case files again. All 22 students were from the same university in Kiev. They had applied for evacuation together. They had traveled together. They should have arrived bonded by shared trauma. But instead, they behaved like strangers. Worse, like enemies trapped in the same cage. Hours passed. Elena left her files scattered across the desk, still unresolved, still disturbing. She tried to sleep, but her instincts wouldn't rest. Something was wrong in a way she couldn't yet name. She wasn't wrong. Deep in the night, screams shattered the quiet halls of the dormitory. The sound jolted Elena upright. She threw on her shoes and rushed into the hallway just as a security guard pounded on her door. "Ma'am, there's trouble on the 3rd floor," students screaming. They ran up the stairs 2 at a time. On the 3rd floor, chaos awaited them. Students crowded the hallway, faces white with fear, eyes wide with panic. Some were frozen in place, others shook uncontrollably. As Elena pushed through the alarmed crowd, she saw room 304 standing open. Inside, a girl named Oksana stood pressed into a corner, trembling violently, tears streaking across her cheeks. Outside the doorway stood Dimitro, fists pounding the doorframe as he shouted desperately, "Let me explain, please." "Oksana, just listen. Get away from me," she screamed back. "You liar! You murderer!" Her voice broke into sobs. Elena stepped between them. "Stop!" she commanded. "Everyone calm down. Tell me what happened." But Oksana did not even look at her. Instead, she pointed at Dimitro, her hand shaking fiercely. "Ask him," she whispered. "Ask him what he did. Ask him why Yuri never got on the plane with us." The hallway went silent. It was as if the very walls were afraid to echo that name. Elena felt the air grow colder. The students watched with expressions carved from guilt, fear, and something darker. Dimitro's face collapsed. Tears spilled from his eyes as he shook his head. "It wasn't my fault," he whispered. "There were only 22 seats. There were 23 of us. Someone had to stay." A small girl pushed through the crowd. Julia. Tears streamed down her face. "Yuri was supposed to be with us," she cried. "Someone told the embassy he was dangerous. Someone lied about him. That's why he was left behind." Oksana sobbed harder. "The Russians bombed our university 2 days after we escaped. Yuri was still there. He died because someone betrayed him." The raw agony of her accusation pierced through the silence. Elena felt something inside her shift. This wasn't simply trauma. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was guilt. This was betrayal. This was a secret these students had carried with them from the war zone. After forcing everyone to return to their rooms, Elena gathered Sister Maria and the campus counselor, Dr. Ramon Santos, first thing in the morning. She explained everything she had witnessed, the accusations, the name Yuri, the silent unity of anguish on their faces. Dr. Santos immediately requested the full evacuation documentation. When he pulled up the original list, the truth revealed itself like a wound torn open. The evacuation list had 23 names before the flight. One student, Yuri Kovalenko, had been removed. Removed because of an anonymous tip submitted 3 days before departure, claiming Yuri held extremist views. Removed because of a lie. Sister Maria covered her mouth with shaking hands. "Does that mean—" Elena finished the sentence for her, voice trembling slightly. "It means one of the 22 students lied and condemned Yuri to die." The counselor added, "And all of them know it." Silence filled the room, weighed down by the enormity of the truth. Later that afternoon, Elena called for the students to gather in the university chapel. The room glowed with candlelight. Marble floors reflected the soft shimmer of stained glass windows. It was a sacred place where secrets could be exhaled and broken souls could speak. The students filed in, still silent, still fractured. They sat never closer than 1 seat apart. Elena stood at the front, taking a deep breath before speaking. "I know the truth," she said finally. "I know what happened to Yuri." The words cut through the room like a knife. Some students flinched, others blinked rapidly, fighting tears. A few looked like they wanted to run. "Someone here filed a false report," she continued. "Someone here lied to save themselves. And because of that lie, Yuri never left Ukraine." Pin-drop silence. The group stared back at her with a mixture of fear and resignation. Then, unexpectedly, a single student rose. Katya, her face pale, her hands trembling, her eyes brimming with tears. "It was me," she whispered. The chapel erupted in gasps. Oksana surged forward like a storm, but Miguel, the Filipino nursing student assigned to support the group, stepped between them just in time. "No!" Oksana shouted over him. "Let me through!" "You don't understand. She killed him." Miguel's calm voice broke through the chaos. "Listen first," he said gently. Katya looked as if she might collapse, but she forced herself to speak. "There were 23 of us, and only 22 seats," she said. "The embassy staff told us if we couldn't decide who stayed behind, none of us would be evacuated. We argued, we screamed. For days, everyone said they deserved to live. No one would volunteer." She wiped her face with trembling hands. "So I lied. I told them Yuri said he wanted to stay and fight. I thought they would send him later. I didn't think they'd abandon him." "You didn't think?" Oksana cried. "You didn't care!" Before Katya could respond, Julia turned to Dimitro, fury blazing through her tears. "And you," she shouted, "you supported her lie. You said the same thing, that Yuri wanted to stay. You helped." Dimitro lowered his head, sobbing. The room erupted again. Accusations, cries, shouts, grief. Every word was soaked in guilt and desperation. The chapel became a battlefield of emotional shrapnel. Elena felt frozen. Where could she even begin to mend such a wound? Then slowly, an elderly volunteer, Lola Carmen, rose from her seat. Her cane tapped softly on the floor as she walked to the front. Her presence alone quieted the room. She did not raise her voice. She didn't have to. "I will tell you a story," she said quietly. Lola Carmen stood at the front of the chapel as though she had always been there, as though she belonged in that moment. Her eyes were soft but steady, weathered by years of surviving things far worse than these young students could imagine. Her presence alone quieted the storm. Even the air seemed to settle. "I will tell you a story," she began softly. The students stilled. Elena stepped back, letting the older woman take the space. She knew that sometimes healing came not from authority, but from memory, memory shaped by suffering and survival. "It was during the time of the Japanese soldiers," Lola Carmen said. "I was only a young girl living in a tiny village. The soldiers had been searching for guerrilla fighters they believed were hiding among us. One afternoon, they marched into the village square and made an announcement." She paused, allowing the dread to settle. "They said that unless we gave them names, they would kill everyone." Her voice did not waver, but her eyes shone with faint tears. "We had 1 hour to decide." A collective shiver passed through the chapel. Just 1 hour to decide who among us would die, so that the rest might live. My parents argued, my neighbors shouted. Mothers clutched their children. People cried, begged, bargained with God. Fear makes monsters out of ordinary people, and saints out of others. No one knew which one they would become. She closed her eyes for a moment, her voice trembling with the memory. Then someone spoke. Someone gave the soldiers 3 names. 3 young men from our village. They were dragged away, shot in the open field by the river. Several students flinched, others covered their mouths, imagining the horror. "For 60 years, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I believed the person who spoke those names was the worst human being alive. I hated them. I blamed them for the blood in the soil." She opened her eyes again, gentle, solemn, shimmering with something deeper. "But when I became an old woman, I learned the truth. The person who spoke those names was one of the 3 who died. He had volunteered himself. He named 2 others who had no families. He gave his own life to save the village. He saved 40 people, including my mother, my siblings, and me." Silence washed over the chapel, a silence so deep it felt like a second skin. "Sometimes," Lola Carmen said, looking directly at Katja, "war forces people into choices that are not choices at all. They are traps. No matter what you choose, you will lose something. And the people who make such choices carry the weight forever." Katja began to sob again, but this time her tears came not from defensiveness, but from recognizing a truth she had been running from. "But I didn't volunteer," she choked. "I didn't sacrifice myself. I pushed the burden onto someone else." "I know, Anak," Lola Carmen said gently, "and that is why it hurts. Loss makes us bleed. Guilt makes us bleed inside. But if you bleed long enough, the wound becomes your story. The question now is not whether you can be forgiven. The question is, can you forgive yourself enough to live a life worthy of the one you left behind?" The chapel felt suspended in time. Elena looked around. Many students cried openly now, some quietly wiping their faces, others trembling as years of suppressed guilt surfaced. Then something miraculous happened. Oksana stepped toward Katja. Her movements were slow, uncertain, trembling. Elena held her breath, unsure whether this would lead to confrontation or compassion. Oksana stopped just a step away from Katja, her voice barely audible. "I hate what you did," she said. "I hate that it was Yuri. I hate everything about that day." She took a shaky breath. "But I don't hate you." Katja lifted her head, eyes wide with shock. "Any one of us," Oksana continued, "could have made that same choice. We were terrified. We were children being asked to decide who deserved to live." Slowly, Oksana reached forward and wrapped her arms around Katja. Katja collapsed into her, sobbing uncontrollably. Around them, the other students watched in shock. Then Julia stood up, walking closer. Dimitro followed, tears streaming down his face. One by one, the students rose, hesitant, scared, aching, and moved toward one another. They didn't all hug, they didn't all forgive, but they acknowledged each other. They breathed the same air again. They allowed themselves to see the humanity in the person standing across from them, the humanity they had been avoiding ever since the bombing that took Yuri's life. For the first time since arriving in the Philippines, they were no longer 22 broken individuals trapped in silence. They were 22 young people who had survived something impossible and were finally ready to face it together. Elena wiped her eyes quietly from the front pew. She knew healing had only begun, and it would be long, imperfect, fragile. But this moment mattered. The story of Yuri's final days and the group's guilt slowly spread across campus. At first, it reached only a few students, then faculty members. Then a journalist from a local media outlet caught wind of it and requested an interview. The students were hesitant. They were afraid of being judged as monsters, traitors, cowards. But Elena reminded them gently, people cannot judge what they do not understand. If you want Yuri to be remembered, not as a casualty, but as a life that mattered, tell your story. So they did. The interview was raw, painful, honest, and when it was published online, it spread far beyond the university's borders. People around the country, then around the world, began sharing it. But not because of the drama. It spread because of what came after. The students came together to create the Yuri Kovalenko Memorial Scholarship Fund, dedicated to helping displaced Ukrainian students continue their education in safe countries. They organized fundraisers, sold artworks, performed music, wrote letters, gave talks. In just a few months, they raised enough money to bring several more Ukrainian refugees to the Philippines. Their grief became purpose, their guilt became movement, their pain became compassion. Next came the Healing Circle, a support group they formed for refugees dealing with impossible choices during wartime. Survivors from across Manila joined. Filipinos who remembered fleeing the Marcos dictatorship, Muslims displaced from conflict-stricken Mindanao, families who had lost everything to natural disasters. They shared stories, they cried together. They held each other through the silence of memories too heavy to voice. It became one of the largest trauma support networks in the region. Julia, the young artist, began painting a series titled 22+1. The collection depicted each student in vivid, emotional detail, with one empty chair in every canvas. That chair represented Yuri, not as a ghost haunting them, but as a presence acknowledging their journey toward forgiveness. The paintings went viral online, donations poured in, messages from around the world flooded their inbox. You inspired me to make amends. You helped me forgive myself. You made me understand my father's choices during the war. You gave me hope. The students were stunned. They had expected condemnation. Instead, they found a global community that understood brokenness, because brokenness is universal. Meanwhile, Miguel became a quiet anchor for the group. He attended every meeting, helped mediate every emotional breakdown, and quietly supported the students through the worst nights. Over time, his friendship with Oksana deepened into something gentler, warmer. They spent long evenings talking on the dorm rooftop, sharing stories of their families, their fears, and the lives they hoped to rebuild. What began as trauma eventually blossomed into love. Dimitro pursued counseling courses at the university, and later became an assistant facilitator for the Healing Circle. He said helping others gave him a sense of redemption, a way to balance the weight he carried. Katya wrote a letter to Yuri's mother. It took her several attempts. She cried through every draft. Finally, she told the truth. Not the sanitized version, not excuses, but the whole painful reality. Weeks passed before she received a reply. I do not forgive you, perhaps I never will. But my son would not want hatred to take another life. So live well. Honor him with how you move forward. It broke Katya open in the best way possible. Months later, CNN reached out, requesting to film a documentary about the students' journey. Elena agreed, but only if the focus was not on sensationalizing the tragedy, but on the healing that followed. During the interview, the reporter asked her, "What makes their story so special?" Elena thought deeply before responding. It shows that real refugee stories are not fairy tales. They are not simple. They are messy. These students came here not only broken by war, but broken by what they had to do to survive. And the Philippines did not give them pity. We gave them space to be flawed, to be human, to heal despite their mistakes. And what they taught me is this: the most powerful thing you can offer another human being is the chance to forgive themselves. Behind her, the students listened with quiet tears. But the story didn't end in Manila. Back in Kyiv, in a small apartment surrounded by cracked walls and partially restored buildings, Yuri's mother visited her son's grave every week. She cleaned the stone, placed flowers, and whispered memories into the cold air. One day, she found a new plaque placed beside the grave, funded by anonymous donors from the Philippines. It read, "Beloved son, friend, dreamer. His memory saved many lives. He is not forgotten." Below the inscription were words in Ukrainian and Tagalog, "No one is left behind." Yuri's mother pressed her fingertips to the lettering and wept, not with bitterness, but with a grief softened by the knowledge that her son's story lived on across the sea. Meanwhile, the 22 students continued rebuilding their lives. They learned that healing wasn't a single moment, but a lifelong journey. Some days were easier, some nights still brought nightmares. But they were no longer facing their ghosts alone. They had learned something profoundly human. You cannot change what you have done. You cannot rewrite the past, but you can decide what to do with the weight of it. And when you share that weight with others, healing begins. Seasons shifted slowly in Manila. What began as a tense and uncertain arrival gradually unfolded into a profound transformation for the 22 students, for the community that embraced them, and for everyone who encountered their story. Life at St. Thomas University began to settle into its own rhythm. The once fragmented group found themselves sharing moments they never believed they could experience again. Moments of normalcy, laughter, grief, and growth. The campus grounds, shaded by towering acacia trees, became a sanctuary where walls built from fear and guilt started to soften, crack, and eventually crumble. Elena watched their evolution with a mixture of pride and protective concern. She knew healing was not linear. Some days brought laughter echoing across the dorm hallways. Other days brought sudden silence, shaking hands, or a student crying alone in a corner. But unlike before, each breakdown was met with support, not isolation. The students had begun turning toward each other instead of away. There were days when Oksana still struggled to look at Katya without feeling a sharp pang of sorrow. The pain did not disappear, it transformed. What once was raw hatred evolved into something quieter, something that still ached but no longer consumed her. Miguel, always gentle and grounded, often sat with her during these moments. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they drank tea in silence. Sometimes he simply held her trembling hands until her breath returned to normal. Their friendship grew roots, slow, steady, resilient. For Dimitro, healing came through responsibility. He attended training sessions for peer counseling and dedicated himself to supporting others in the healing circle. His commitment was not born from a desire to be seen as a hero. It was his way of confronting the part of himself that once stood silently behind a lie. In helping others, he learned to forgive the frightened version of himself from the past. The healing circle itself expanded rapidly. What began with a handful of students sitting on plastic chairs near the campus garden grew into a weekly gathering that filled an entire hall. Refugees, survivors, students, and locals came together, each carrying their own kind of wound. They shared stories of lost parents, destroyed homes, political violence, typhoons, betrayals, and quiet acts of bravery that had saved lives in moments of chaos. One evening, a Filipino father stood in front of the group with tears streaming down his face. He spoke about the night his family fled their home during a violent clash in Mindanao. He carried his daughter on his back, his wife beside him, but he was forced to leave behind his younger brother, who had been wounded. It was a choice that haunted him every night. When he finished speaking, Katya walked to him, took his hand gently, and whispered words she once wished someone had told her. "You chose the only way you could love in that moment." The man cried harder and embraced her. Stories like this repeated again and again. Broken pieces finding other broken pieces, fitting together into something unexpectedly whole. Meanwhile, Julia flourished as an artist. Her 22+1 series was displayed on campus before being invited to galleries around the city. One of her most moving pieces depicted a group of students standing in a dimly lit hallway, each reaching out toward the empty chair in the center of the room, hands trembling but hopeful. Another showed a young man's silhouette standing before a burning university building, the flames illuminating a path where shadows of 22 figures stood behind him, reaching not in fear, but in remembrance. Each canvas she painted seemed to peel another layer from her heart. During one gallery opening, a woman approached Julia in tears. She revealed that she had lost her son during a bombing in Syria. "Your paintings," she said, "made me feel like someone understands the ache I have carried alone all these years." Julia hugged her, both of them crying openly. It was then Julia realized that art could pull suffering into the light where it could finally breathe. As their story continued spreading online, international organizations reached out, asking to collaborate with the scholarship fund the students had created. Donations arrived from strangers around the world: teachers, artists, parents, doctors, former refugees, and even soldiers who had once fought in wars and carried guilt of their own. Letters poured in, from children who said they were inspired to help refugees, from elderly survivors who saw their younger selves in the 22 students, from veterans who wrote about choices made on the battlefield that haunted them, and from others who simply wanted to say, "Thank you for showing us that broken people can still change the world." Months turned into nearly a year, and the students stood at the threshold of a new chapter. The time came for many of them to plan their future. Degrees to pursue, careers to choose, lives to rebuild. But before any of them could take that next step, they felt a collective pull towards something unfinished. A journey they had avoided, a truth they needed to face. They needed to return to Yuri's memory, not in shame, but in honor. And so, at the end of the academic term, the group gathered in the chapel once more. Almost exactly where the walls had once echoed, with accusations and pain, they now sat in stillness, each holding a letter, a drawing, or a memory they wanted to send across the sea to Yuri's mother. Oksana brought a small wooden carving of a sunflower. Julia carried prints of her paintings. Dimitro wrote a poem. Katya held a letter she had rewritten many times. They bundled all of it carefully and asked Elena to send it to Ukraine. It took weeks before a response came. When it arrived, the envelope was addressed not to one student, but to all 22. Inside was a handwritten letter from Yuri's mother. Her penmanship was delicate, the ink slightly smudged as though touched by tears. "I have read your words. I have seen your gifts, and I have felt your sorrow. I will not tell you I have forgiven everything. A mother's heart does not heal quickly. But I will tell you this, I no longer carry anger. What you have done with your grief is more than many could do. You have turned my son's absence into a light for others. You have taken responsibility, you have shown courage, and you have shown love. So I ask only one thing: live. Live with purpose. Live in a way that honors the life my son never had the chance to finish." The students wept as Elena read the letter aloud. Later that same week, a package arrived from Kiev. Inside was a photograph of Yuri as a child, smiling, holding a sunflower in one hand and a book in the other. Along with it was a small, worn notebook filled with sketches, poems, and dreams he had written for his future. The students placed these items in a special spot in the dormitory common area, a memorial they built together, not as a shrine to guilt, but as a reminder of how far they had come. The impact of their story continued to ripple. When the CNN documentary aired, millions of people around the world watched the 22 students recount their journey, from trauma and betrayal to reconciliation and healing. In the final scene, the reporter asked Elena, "What did you learn from them?" After everything, her answer was simple yet profound: that healing begins the moment someone chooses to step out of their shame, and forgiveness begins the moment someone else chooses to see them, not as what they did, but as who they are becoming. The documentary ended with footage of the students holding candles in the chapel, 22 lights glowing softly, and one empty candle holder in the center. Not to represent absence, but to represent presence. A presence felt in every step they took toward the life ahead of them. Back in Ukraine, Yuri's mother visited his grave more often. Each time, she placed fresh flowers beside the plaque funded by the students. Sometimes she sat for hours, holding the letters they had written, imagining them growing, loving, rebuilding, living. Near the base of his headstone, the inscription remained, "Beloved son, friend, dreamer." His memory saved many lives. He is not forgotten. Below it, in Ukrainian and Tagalog, the words, "No one is left behind." And so the 22 students carried that message with them wherever they went. Into classrooms, counseling centers, art studios, community gatherings, refugee shelters, and their own quiet moments of reflection. They learned that redemption is not granted all at once. It is lived day by day, choice by choice. They learned that healing is not forgetting the past. It is learning to carry its weight without letting it break you. They learned that forgiveness is not erasing what happened. It is reshaping how you move forward from it. And above all, they learned that even the most impossible stories can lead to hope when shared with honesty, courage, and compassion. Their journey began in silence and distance. It blossomed into connection, purpose, and love. And it continued to ripple outward, touching strangers across the world who had never met Yuri, never seen the chapel where truths were spoken, never sat in the healing circle, but who understood the universal language of pain, responsibility, and the hunger for redemption. In the end, the 22 students discovered something profound. You cannot change the past. You cannot erase the choices made in fear. You cannot bring back the people lost. But you can choose what kind of person you become afterward. You can choose to build instead of destroy. You can choose to heal instead of hide. You can choose to forgive and be forgiven. And when a community chooses to carry the weight together, no one is ever truly left behind.